The wall did not fall because of a titan. That is what made it so terrifying. The colossal titan had breached Wall Maria before humanity knew what that looked like, knew the sound of stone crumbling under steam and weight, knew the screaming that followed. But on the morning that changed everything, there was no titan on the horizon. There was no warning tremor in the earth, no roar shaking the clouds apart. There was only a man, small and bald and dressed in a white cape that had no right to exist in a world like this one, falling from the sky at a speed that had no name in any language the Survey Corps had ever developed. He didn't crash. He landed. 1 foot touched the earth outside Wall Rose, and the impact didn't kill him. It killed the ground around him. A crater 40 meters wide opened like a mouth, and the shockwave that rolled outward didn't just knock soldiers off their feet. It erased 3 titans that had been advancing on a scouting unit, not by cutting them or stabbing them in the nape, but by catching them mid-stride and simply ending them, like candles snuffed by a passing hand. Commander Erwin Smith stood on the top of the wall, looked down at that crater, looked at the man standing in the center of it staring at his own fist with an expression of mild disappointment, and said nothing for a very long time. Because what he was seeing did not fit inside any category humanity had built to survive. This was not a titan. This was not a soldier. This was something the world had no framework for, and the world was about to find out exactly what that meant. If you've never seen a story where a single man makes the entire Titan War irrelevant, you are not ready for what comes next. Subscribe before part 2, because after what happens inside those walls, there is no going back, and neither will you be. The first thing anyone noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the specific kind of silence that follows something so fundamentally wrong that the human brain refuses to process it in real time. The scouting unit that had been pinned down outside Wall Rose, 4 soldiers, 2 of them wounded, all of them certain they were about to die, had been watching 3 pure titans close in from the tree line when the sky cracked. That was the only word any of them used in their later reports. Cracked. Like something had punched through the atmosphere from above and the air itself had split to make room. The object that came down wasn't a meteor. It wasn't a cannonball. It was a man, falling feet first, arms crossed, expression somewhere between bored and mildly annoyed, and when he hit the ground the soldiers didn't see the impact so much as feel it pass through their chests like a second heartbeat. The shockwave was not violent in the way explosions are violent. It was absolute. It moved outward from the crater in a clean ring, and the 3 titans that had been mid-stride toward the scouting unit simply ceased to continue existing in the way they had been. 2 of them were thrown backward with enough force to scatter their bodies across 200 meters of open field, and the 3rd one, the closest, the one that had already been reaching down toward the nearest soldier, lost the upper half of its body entirely, not from any blade or explosive, but from the displaced air alone. The man stood in the center of the crater he had made and looked at his own fist. He hadn't even punched anything yet. He unclenched his hand, flexed his fingers once, and looked around at the landscape of Paradise Island with the particular expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unfamiliar and is already reasonably certain it isn't going to be interesting. His name was Saitama. He had no memory of how he had arrived here. One moment he had been sitting in his apartment eating instant noodles and considering whether the sale at the market was worth walking 20 minutes for, and the next moment he was here, in a field, under a sky that smelled like smoke and iron, with 4 soldiers in strange uniforms staring at him from the ground like he was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. He found this mildly confusing, because he hadn't done anything yet. The soldiers did not run. To their credit, they were Survey Corps, and Survey Corps soldiers were selected precisely because they did not run when their instincts screamed at them to. But not running and being functional were 2 different things, and for approximately 15 seconds none of the 4 of them managed to speak, move, or do anything except breathe. It was Private Dita Ness who finally pushed himself upright and reached for the grip of his ODM gear, not because he believed it would help, but because having a hand on something familiar gave his brain enough of an anchor to form words. He asked, in a voice he would later describe as embarrassingly high, whether the figure in the crater was a titan. Saitama looked at him. Then he looked down at himself. Then he looked back at Ness and said no, he was a hero, and asked where the nearest convenience store was. Nobody answered that question, partly because the concept required translation through layers of confusion that none of them had the cognitive space for at that moment, and partly because up on the top of Wall Rose, the situation had already passed beyond the scouting unit's authority to manage. Commander Erwin Smith had been observing the tree line through a long-range scope when the impact happened, and he had seen everything from the elevated angle of the wall's surface, the descent, the crater, the instant annihilation of 3 titans, and the man now standing in the rubble having what appeared to be a perfectly calm conversation. Erwin lowered the scope. He looked at the soldier beside him, a senior aide named Eld, and told him to send a rider to Hange Zoe immediately. Not a signal flare. A rider, because what he had just seen could not be communicated in a flare code, and because whatever was standing in that crater was either the most dangerous thing humanity had ever encountered, or the only thing that had ever made the Titans look small. Possibly, he thought, both of those things were true at the same time. Hange received the message 20 minutes later in the middle of a Titan anatomy briefing, read the aide's transcription of Erwin's exact words twice, and immediately began walking toward the stables while still talking, leaving 12 junior researchers standing in a half-finished lecture with diagrams on the board and no instructor. By the time she reached the wall's gate, she was running. The soldiers on the ground had managed to form a loose perimeter around Saitama's crater, not a combat perimeter, more the kind of uncertain semicircle that forms when people feel they should be doing something but have no framework for what that something is. Saitama had stepped out of the crater by then, and was standing on the flat ground near its edge, looking at the remains of the Titans with mild curiosity. He nudged one of the larger scattered pieces with his foot. It dissolved into steam almost immediately, the way Titan flesh always did once the nape was destroyed, and he watched the vapor rise with the look of someone reading instructions on a product that turned out to be less complicated than expected. He said, mostly to himself, but loud enough that 2 of the soldiers heard him clearly, that this world seemed easy. Neither soldier reported that comment immediately, but both of them would remember it for the rest of their lives, because, in retrospect, standing at the edge of that crater on that quiet morning, with the steam still rising and the wall still intact, and the world still operating on its old rules, that throwaway observation was the most accurate thing anyone would say for a very long time. Hange Zoe arrived at the outer gate of Wall Rose at a speed that impressed even the soldiers who had seen her sprint toward Titan cage experiments with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for running away from them. She was through the gate before it had fully opened, sliding the last few feet on the gravel path and grabbing the arm of the nearest soldier to stop herself, demanding a full situation report before she had caught her breath. The soldier gave her one, haltingly, with the particular verbal stumbling of someone describing something they haven't yet convinced themselves actually happened. A man fell from the sky. He made a crater. 3 Titans died from the landing alone. He is standing over there and he asked about a convenience store. Hange released the soldier's arm, pushed her glasses up her nose, and turned to look at Saitama with an expression that the soldiers nearby would later describe as the most frightening thing they witnessed that entire day, including the crater, because it was the expression Hange made when she found something so interesting that the part of her brain responsible for self-preservation had quietly gone offline. She walked toward him directly, which broke every protocol the Survey Corps had developed for approaching unknown entities of potential Titan classification. The standing order was observation at distance, then containment assessment, then controlled approach under full ODM readiness. Hange skipped all 3 steps in approximately 4 seconds and covered the ground between herself and Saitama at a pace that made her aide, Moblet, break into a jog just to stay close enough to intervene if something went catastrophically wrong. Saitama watched her come. He didn't move, didn't shift his stance, didn't show any reaction beyond the mild acknowledgement of someone watching a person approach who clearly has something to say. When she stopped 2 meters in front of him and began asking questions, she asked 6 of them in a single breath without waiting for answers to any of them, which was standard operating procedure for Hange when she encountered something new and extraordinary. What are you? Where did you come from? How did you survive the impact? Did you feel the shockwave? Are you in pain? What is your body temperature? Saitama answered the ones he could. He was a hero. He didn't know where he came from, specifically this place, though he was originally from Z-City. He hadn't survived the impact so much as made it since he was the one who landed. He hadn't noticed a shockwave. He wasn't in pain. He didn't know his body temperature off the top of his head, but he felt fine. Hange stared at him through each answer with the focused intensity of someone transcribing information in real time inside their own skull. And when he finished, she turned to Moblet and said, quietly but with complete conviction, that this was the most significant day in the history of human scientific inquiry since the discovery of Titan anatomy, and that she needed paper. Moblet, who had learned years ago to simply accept these statements and respond practically, produced a notebook from his coat. What Hange was beginning to understand, and what she was almost alone in being able to articulate at that moment, was that Saitama did not register as a threat in the way the Survey Corps had been trained to identify threats. He had no Titan features. He had no abnormal physiology that she could observe from the outside. He was standing in a 40-meter crater that he had personally created with his own landing and showing no signs of injury, exertion, or even elevated breathing. But he was also holding a perfectly normal conversation in a language that, while slightly accented and occasionally using words she didn't recognize, was comprehensible. He was not aggressive. He was not hunting. He was, if anything, slightly bored, which was its own category of deeply unsettling, because the only things that had ever looked bored in proximity to mass destruction in this world were Titans, and Titans did not ask about convenience stores. While Hange interviewed Saitama with escalating excitement and diminishing scientific distance, she had moved from 2 meters to roughly half a meter without appearing to notice. The situation on the wall above had been developing along a separate track entirely. Erwin Smith had sent 3 separate messages in the time since the landing, one to Hange, one to Commander-in-Chief Darius Zackley, and one to Captain Levi, who was currently 3 kilometers east running a separate patrol. Levi's response arrived first, which was typical, and it consisted of 4 words that his aide read aloud to Erwin with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message they personally found alarming. "I'm already on my way." Erwin folded the response, put it in his coat, and said nothing. The fact that Levi had already determined something required his personal attention, before receiving any detailed description of what had happened, meant that the shockwave from the landing had been felt 3 kilometers away, and had registered immediately as something outside normal Titan parameters. Levi had been in the field long enough that his instincts had replaced most of the cognitive steps between perception and decision. Something had hit the earth hard enough to be felt at distance, and it had not been a Titan. That was enough. He arrived on horseback 12 minutes later and brought his horse to a stop at the edge of the crater's rim, looking down at the displaced earth and the scattered Titan remains and the 2 figures standing near the center, one small, bald, and utterly still, and one gesturing with increasing animation while holding a notebook. Levi looked at the crater for a long time. Then he looked at the Titan remains. Then he looked at Saitama. His expression did not change, because Levi's expression rarely changed, but the quality of his attention shifted in a way that the soldiers near him recognized as the particular focus he applied to things that he had categorized as genuinely dangerous rather than merely difficult. He dismounted, walked to the crater's edge, and when Saitama looked up and met his eyes across the distance, neither of them looked away. Levi had faced Titans, Annie Leonhardt, the female Titan, the beast Titan, and things that should have killed him 17 times over, and his assessment of threats was not built on fear but on accumulated precise measurement. What he saw when he looked at Saitama was not a monster. It was not a soldier. It was the complete and total absence of a ceiling, and that, in Levi's experience, was the most dangerous thing in any world. Descended into the crater. Hange noticed and called his name in a tone that was half greeting and half warning. Levi ignored both halves. He stopped 4 meters from Saitama and said, without preamble, that he needed to know one thing. Saitama waited. Levi asked whether he was an enemy. Saitama thought about this with genuine consideration, which was not the response Levi had expected, and then said that he wasn't planning on it, but that he was pretty hard to stop if he decided to punch something. Levi held the silence for 3 full seconds, then said that he had noticed, and looked back at the Titan remains. The conversation was brief and contained no resolution, no alliance, no threat. But every soldier watching from the wall's edge understood that something had just been established between those 2 figures that would define everything that came after, and that the world they had woken up in that morning no longer operated by the same rules it had the night before. The report that reached the interior military police and the royal government in Mitras did not travel through standard channels, because standard channels had word limits and formatting requirements, and a chain of review that would have taken 3 days, and produced a document so sanitized by institutional caution that it would have been functionally useless. Erwin Smith knew this, which was why he bypassed all of it and sent a personal courier with a sealed letter addressed directly to Commander-in-Chief Zackley, marked with the specific notation that indicated the contents were time-sensitive and classification-exempt. A notation that Erwin had used exactly twice before in his career, and both times had preceded events that restructured military policy for the following decade. The courier made the ride to Mitras in 7 hours. Zackley read the letter in 4 minutes, read it again in 2, then sat in his chair for a long time without moving while his adjutant stood near the door pretending not to exist. When Zackley finally spoke, he said that he needed Ambassador Rogue and the first interior chair in this room within the hour, and that if either of them was unavailable they were to be made available, and that nobody outside this building was to be told why. The letter described, in Erwin's characteristically precise and unembellished language, the following sequence of events. An unidentified human-presenting entity had descended from the upper atmosphere at terminal plus velocity, impacted the Earth outside wall rows without injury to itself, eliminated 3 pure Titans through displacement shockwave alone without physical contact, demonstrated verbal communication in a recognizable language dialect, showed no biological markers consistent with Titan shifter transformation, and was currently in the custody. And Erwin had written the word custody with what his adjutant would later describe as an almost audible awareness that it wasn't quite the right word, of Section Commander Hange Zoe, pending further assessment. The letter ended with a single sentence that was not a recommendation or a request, but simply an observation, delivered in the flat tone of a man who had learned to state facts without the distortion of emotion. That based on what he had witnessed, the entity represented a variable for which the current military and governmental framework had no existing response protocol, and that this gap required immediate attention before the information became public knowledge, and the gap became a crisis. Zackley convened the emergency session in 90 minutes, which was faster than his adjutant had thought possible given the political geography of Mitras at that hour. Ambassador Rogue arrived looking irritated, which was his default state. First Interior Chair Browning arrived looking frightened, which was not his default state, and therefore told Zackley more than anything Browning subsequently said. The session lasted 4 hours and produced 2 things of substance. A classified designation for Saitama as an unclassified strategic anomaly, a category that had never previously existed in the royal government's threat taxonomy, and had to be created during the session itself, by Browning's legal aid writing in a notebook while people talked over him. and a direct order to Erwin Smith to maintain complete information control over the entity's existence until the government determined a containment and assessment strategy. The second thing the session produced was a disagreement so fundamental that it wasn't resolved by the end of the 4 hours and wasn't going to be, because it touched something the royal government had been carefully not touching for a very long time. The disagreement was this: Rogue believed the entity was a weapon, not metaphorically, not as a classification, but literally, that something capable of killing Titans through the incidental force of its own landing was a military asset of incalculable value, and that the correct response was immediate controlled integration into the defense framework under royal authority. Browning believed the entity was a threat, also not metaphorically. His position was that anything the government could not understand, could not contain, and could not predict represented an existential danger to the existing power structure, and that the correct response was to eliminate it before it understood enough about their world to become a problem they couldn't solve. The fact that neither of them had any specific idea how to accomplish either of those objectives, integration or elimination, was the part of the conversation that filled most of the 4 hours without resolution. Back outside Wall Rose, the subject of this conversation was sitting on a rock eating a rice ball that Hange's aide Moblet had produced from somewhere, because Moblet was the kind of person who always had food available for emergencies, and this had qualified. Hange was sitting cross-legged on the ground 3 feet away, filling her 6th page of notes, asking questions at a pace that had slowed from the initial barrage into something more like a rhythm, a call and response that she had unconsciously structured to match Saitama's pattern of answering, brief, direct, occasionally accompanied by a small gesture, never embellished. She had learned more about him in 3 hours than the government session in Mitra's would produce in 4, though none of what she had learned fit into any existing category she possessed. He had trained to become a hero. He had trained for 3 years. He could not be hurt. He found fighting unrewarding because it ended too quickly. He was looking for a worthy opponent and had not found one in what she was beginning to understand was an extremely long time. Levi was stationed 20 meters away on a flat rock, sharpening a blade he had already sharpened twice, watching the conversation and watching the horizon with the same divided attention he applied to everything in the field. He had said nothing since his initial exchange with Saitama in the crater, but he had not left, and the soldiers who knew him understood that Levi's continued physical presence near something was its own form of statement. He was not guarding Saitama. He was observing him, which was different, and the distinction mattered in ways that would take weeks to fully articulate. What Levi was processing, in the quiet mechanical way he processed things that required long consideration, was the specific texture of Saitama's boredom. He had seen soldiers become numb. He had seen veterans stop flinching. He had never seen someone for whom the complete annihilation of a threat registered as mildly disappointing, rather than as relief or triumph or anything in the range of normal human response to survival. That specific texture, he thought, was more informative than anything Hange's questions were producing, because it told him not just what Saitama could do, but what Saitama had already done, over and over, for long enough that it had become routine. And whatever world had made that kind of routine possible was not a world with anything resembling the Titans of Parodies, which meant that whatever Saitama was, he had not arrived here because this place challenged him. He had arrived here and was discovering, with visible lack of excitement, that it didn't either. Erwin received the government's containment order via return courier at dusk. He read it, folded it, and placed it in his coat next to Levi's earlier message. Then he walked to the edge of the wall and looked down at the camp that had assembled around Saitama's crater, at the lantern light and the soldiers and Hange's silhouette still bent over her notebook, and at the still, small figure sitting on the rock in the middle of all of it, looking at the darkening sky with an expression that Erwin, even at this distance, recognized as the particular blankness of someone waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. He understood, with the cold clarity that had made him commander, that the government's order was already obsolete. You could not contain information about something that had erased 3 titans in front of witnesses on open ground in daylight. The witnesses were already talking. By morning, the story would be inside the wall. By the end of the week, it would be in every district. The only question that remained was what the story would say, and more importantly, what Saitama would do next, because whatever that turned out to be, no order from Mitras was going to change it. The decision to bring Saitama inside Wall Rose was not made by the government, which had explicitly ordered the opposite, and it was not made by Erwin Smith, who had received that order and technically remained bound by it until he chose not to be. It was made by Hanj Zoe at approximately 6 in the morning, on the grounds that keeping an entity of unknown classification outside an unfortified position overnight with minimal troop presence was a tactically indefensible decision, regardless of what any political body in Mitras thought about containment strategy. She framed this reasoning in a written field note that she left with Moblet in case anyone asked, and then she simply walked up to Saitama, told him that there was a town on the other side of the wall with actual food and a place to sleep, and asked if he wanted to come. Saitama said sure and stood up, and that was the entire decision-making process. The gate opened, they walked through, and by the time Erwin learned what had happened, he was looking at the situation from the wrong side of an already closed door, and making the calculated determination that stopping it now would cause more disruption than letting it continue under observation. The town inside Wall Rose was called Karen's, a mid-sized district settlement with a permanent population of several thousand, and the particular atmosphere of a place that had been living in the long shadow of Wall Maria's fall long enough that fear had settled into its architecture, into the way people walked, and how loudly they spoke in public spaces, and how quickly conversations stopped when a soldier's uniform appeared in a doorway. It was not a happy town, but it was a functioning one, and it was entirely unprepared for what walked through its eastern gates shortly after sunrise on an otherwise ordinary morning. Word had moved faster than the gate had opened, because word always did. The soldiers who had been present at the crater had talked through the night despite orders, because soldiers always did that too. And by the time Saitama walked down Karen's main road with Hanj beside him and Moblet slightly behind and Levi at a precise distance of 15 meters to the left, there were already people in doorways and at windows, and the particular quality of their silence was different from the silence the soldiers had maintained at the crater. That silence had been shock. This silence was something closer to awe compressed tightly against a frame of collective disbelief, like a crowd watching someone walk a tightrope over something they shouldn't survive. Saitama looked at the town with the genuine mild interest of someone who had just arrived in an unfamiliar city and was taking in the layout. He noted that the buildings were old. He noted that the streets were narrow. He asked Hanj what the population of this particular settlement was, and she told him, and he made the small non-committal sound of someone filing information away without a strong reaction to it. He did not notice the starring, or if he did he gave no sign of it, which was consistent with a man who had spent years in a world where his existence generated reactions ranging from indifference to adulation, and had long since stopped calibrating his behavior to either. A child near the market square, no older than 8, broke from a doorway and ran to the edge of the road and stared up at him with wide eyes and asked, very directly in the way that children ask things that adults have already decided not to ask, whether he was the one who killed the Titans this morning. Saitama looked down at her. He said yes. She asked how. He said he punched them, except technically he hadn't, but the landing had done the work, so it was close enough. The child processed this for a moment and then told him that her father had been eaten by a Titan when she was 4. Saitama looked at her for a long time without speaking, and then he told her that he was sorry about that. Nothing else. No promise, no heroic declaration, no speech about protecting people, just the simple acknowledgement of a loss from a person who understood what it meant to have a reason behind why he did what he did, and had learned a long time ago that the reason didn't always make the doing feel like enough. Hange watched this exchange from 2 steps back and wrote nothing in her notebook for the first time since she'd arrived at the crater. Levi, from his 15-meter distance, also watched and recalibrated something in his ongoing assessment without changing his expression or his pace. The crowd in the market square had grown considerably by then, pressing inward from the side streets with the momentum of a gathering that hadn't been planned and therefore had no formal boundary. And the soldiers Erwin had quietly deployed ahead of the group were doing the functional equivalent of holding back a tide with their hands spread wide, not because the crowd was hostile, but because crowds of that density around an unknown variable were their own category of unpredictable. Then a man near the back of the square, a large man in a laborer's coat who had been listening to the story travel from person to person around him like a fire moving through dry grass, shouted a question that cut through the ambient noise and landed in the sudden quiet that followed it like a stone dropped into still water. He asked whether the man in the cape could kill all the Titans. Every one of them. Could he just go out there and end it? The square went very quiet. The question had been in every person's mind since the word had first reached them, but there is a particular social compact around hope in places that have been disappointed by it repeatedly. A mutual agreement not to say the thing out loud because saying it creates an obligation on the part of the universe to answer, and the universe in this world had a long record of answering badly. Now it was said, and every face in the square turned toward Saitama with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite demand, but the precise mixture of the two that forms in people who have been waiting for rescue long enough that they've started to confuse it with a debt being owed. Saitama looked at the man who had asked. Then he looked around the square at all the other faces. He scratched the back of his head with one hand and said that he probably could, yeah, if the Titans around here were all roughly the size of the ones from this morning, because those hadn't been much. The square didn't erupt. It went through a sequence, silence, then a sound that started low and grew, not cheering exactly but something more raw than cheering, the sound of a collective exhale that had been held for years, the sound of a wall inside people that was older and less visible than the ones made of stone beginning to develop its first crack. Erwin, receiving reports of this in real time from 3 separate observers, understood immediately that the government's containment strategy had just become a historical document. The information was no longer inside a military perimeter. It was inside the wall, inside the population, spreading through cairns at the speed of human speech and human need, and within 48 hours it would be in Trost and Amich and every district settlement between here and Mitras. More critically, it would reach the ears of people for whom it would not be simply news but leverage, political factions that had been waiting for a disruption to the existing power structure, military reformers who had been arguing for years that the walls were a prison and not a defense, and further afield, in ways Erwin was only beginning to calculate Marley. He sat down at his field desk, opened a blank sheet of paper, and began writing a new strategic assessment from the first line, because the old one had become irrelevant sometime in the last 12 hours, and he was not a man who continued working from obsolete documents. At the top of the page he wrote a single heading, not a title but a question, the question that every strategic assessment he had ever written had ultimately been organized around, the one he returned to whenever the world rearranged itself faster than planning could accommodate. He wrote, "What does this change, and for whom, and how fast?" Then he began answering it, knowing that the answers were going to be uncomfortable, knowing also that uncomfortable answers arrived at early were significantly more useful than comfortable ones arrived at too late. The emergency session of the Unified Military Command convened in Trost 3 days after Saitama walked through the gates of Cairns, and it was the first time in 11 years that representatives of the Survey Corps, the Garrison Regiment, and the military police brigade had sat in the same room without a formal agenda distributed in advance, which told every person present that whoever had called the meeting was more concerned with speed than protocol. And protocol was usually the thing these institutions protected most fiercely, because it was the thing that determined who had power over whom. Commander-in-Chief Zackley sat at the head of the table and said nothing for the first 3 minutes while the room settled, which was a technique he used to remind people that the silence belonged to him and would end when he decided it should. When he spoke, he did not summarize the events outside Wall Rose, because everyone in the room had already received reports, had already formed opinions, and had already begun the process of defending those opinions before anyone else could challenge them. Instead, he asked a single question. He asked what they intended to do with the asset. The word asset landed in the room differently for different people. Garrison Commander Pixis, who was sitting to Zackley's left with a flask he was making no particular effort to conceal, registered it with a slight tilt of his head that indicated he found the framing presumptuous. Chief of the Military Police Niall Dock, sitting directly across from Pixis, registered it with a small nod that indicated he found the framing exactly correct. Erwin Smith, seated at the far end of the table with Hange beside him and a folder of field notes he had not opened, registered it with no visible reaction at all, because he had spent the past 3 days constructing a position that was built on the premise that the word asset was not only presumptuous but strategically dangerous, and he was waiting for the precise moment to say so. That moment arrived sooner than he expected, because Niall Dock spoke before anyone else had fully processed Zackley's question. And what Niall said was that the military police should be given primary jurisdiction over the entity's movements, housing, and operational deployment, on the grounds that matters of interior security fell under their mandate, and the entity was currently operating inside the walls. Pixis laughed. It was a short sound, but it contained a complete argument. He said that the military police's experience with threats that operated outside Wall Sina was limited to paperwork, and that handing jurisdiction of something that had atomized 3 Titans through its landing to an institution that spent most of its time managing civilian curfews was the category of decision that people wrote cautionary histories about. Niall began to respond, and Erwin spoke across him, not loudly but with the precise calibration of a voice that had learned to cut through noise, by being the only one in the room that sounded like it already knew where the conversation was going. He said that jurisdiction was the wrong framework entirely, and that the word asset was the wrong word, and that both errors were leading the room toward a strategic position that would produce a catastrophic outcome faster than any Titan offensive in recorded history. The room gave him its attention, because Erwin's record in that room was sufficient that, when he said something would produce a catastrophic outcome, the people present had learned to at least hear the reasoning before dismissing it. He said this: Saitama was not an asset because assets were things you controlled, and there was nothing in this room, in this building, in this entire military apparatus, that was capable of controlling something that had survived a descent from the upper atmosphere and killed 3 Titans as an incidental byproduct of standing up. Any strategy built on the assumption of control was a strategy built on a fiction, and fictions in military planning had a consistent historical record of becoming disasters at the worst possible moment. The correct framework was not asset management. It was relationship management, and those were fundamentally different disciplines requiring fundamentally different approaches. Hange, who had been sitting beside Erwin with her notebook open and her pen moving steadily, spoke for the first time to add that, in 72 hours of direct interaction with Saitama, she had not identified a single aggressive impulse directed toward any human being, that his behavioral profile was consistent with profound ennui rather than hostility, and that the single most destabilizing thing the military could do at this juncture was attempt a containment action that failed. Because a failed containment attempt would not only leave them in the same position they were currently in, but would do so after demonstrating to Saitama that they had tried to constrain him, and she had no data on how he would respond to that, but she had significant data on how beings with limitless physical capacity responded to betrayal, and it was not a data set anyone in this room wanted to test. The room was quiet for a moment after this. Then Niall said that Hange's 72-hour behavioral assessment of an unknown entity was not a sufficient basis for military policy, and that the interior had received communication from certain members of the royal government that strongly suggested a more decisive approach was warranted. Erwin asked which members. Niall didn't answer, which was itself an answer, and Pixis, who had been listening with the expression of someone watching a card game where he could see everyone's hand, said that if the royal government was already sending private communications to the military police about this situation, then they were approximately 48 hours behind where they thought they were in terms of controlling the narrative, and that someone should tell Zackley. Zackley, who had been listening to all of this with the stillness of a man, who had convened the meeting precisely to hear these positions expressed, so he could measure them, said that he had already received the same communication from the royal government, that he found it politically interesting and strategically illiterate, and that the meeting would now move to the question of Titans. Because that was the other half of the room's tension that had not yet been addressed. In the 3 days since Saitama had arrived, Survey Corps patrol units operating in the territory outside Wall Rose had reported a measurable change in Titan activity patterns. The pure Titans that normally ranged across the open fields between the walls and the forest had been moving differently, not retreating exactly, but dispersing, spreading to the edges of their normal ranges in patterns that the more experienced trackers described as avoidance behavior, which was a category of Titan behavior that had not been formally documented because Titans, as a rule, did not avoid anything. They moved toward human presence with the indifferent inevitability of a force of nature, and the concept of something that made them want to be somewhere else was not part of the existing behavioral taxonomy. And yet the data from 3 days of patrol was consistent, and the word the trackers kept using, with increasing certainty and decreasing comfort, was avoidance. Something had changed in the territory outside Wall Rose, and the only new variable in that territory was the crater and the man who had made it. Levi, who had not been invited to the command session, but had come anyway and was standing near the back wall in the particular posture that indicated he was present as an observer rather than a participant, but would become a participant if the conversation went somewhere that required it, said one thing during the entire meeting. He said it during a pause between arguments, quietly enough that only the people nearest him heard it directly, though it spread through the room quickly enough to reach Erwin in about 4 seconds. He said that if the Titans were already changing their behavior in response to Saitama's presence, and nobody had asked Saitama to do anything yet, then the question of what to do with him was probably less important than the question of what happened to the entire Titan threat model when Saitama eventually got bored enough to go for a walk. The room didn't respond to this immediately. But Erwin opened his folder for the first time since sitting down, and on the first page of his strategic assessment, under the heading he had written 3 days ago, was a line that said exactly the same thing in different words, and he had underlined it twice. The intelligence reached Zeke Yeager on the 14th day after Saitama's arrival, carried in a coded dispatch from one of the Marlian infiltration contacts, embedded in the merchant networks that moved between the port settlements and the interior districts of Parades. The contact had no military training and no analytical framework for what they were reporting, which meant the dispatch read less like an intelligence document and more like the account of someone who had witnessed something they couldn't explain and were trying very hard not to sound like they had lost their mind in the process of describing it. Zeke read it once in his tent in the forest of the Southern Territory, then read it again more slowly, then set it down on the map table and looked at it for a while without touching it, The way you look at something you want to make sure is still saying what you thought it said. It was. An unidentified human male had arrived in the territory outside Wall Rose from an unknown point of origin, had eliminated multiple pure titans through impact force alone, without transformation or physical contact, had been taken inside the wall by Survey Corps personnel, and was currently residing somewhere in the district settlements of Wall Rose with what the contact described, with visible bewilderment in every word, as complete freedom of movement and no observable containment. Zeke Yeager was not a man who frightened easily or processed information through an emotional register when an analytical one was available. He had inherited his father's capacity for vision and his grandfather's capacity for patience, and had added to both a quality that was entirely his own, a kind of cold structural intelligence that looked at any situation and immediately began identifying the load-bearing elements, the things that if removed would cause the entire architecture to collapse. He was looking at the dispatch now through exactly that lens, and what he was finding was that almost every load-bearing element of the current strategic picture had shifted. The Marleyan operation on Parades was built on a specific foundation. The founding Titan was the supreme power on the island. The pure Titans were an inexhaustible tactical resource, and the subjects of Ymir were ultimately controllable through the power structure that Titan ability created and enforced. Remove any one of those elements and the foundation cracked. The dispatch was suggesting that all three had been compromised simultaneously by the arrival of a single entity, and that was not a strategic adjustment. That was a strategic collapse. He called his unit commanders together that evening. Not all of them, just the three who needed to know and could process it without becoming problems, which was a smaller group than it sounded. He read them the relevant sections of the dispatch without commentary and then watched their faces while they caught up to what it meant. Pike, who commanded the Cart Titan and whose intelligence Zeke trusted more than anyone else in the field, asked two questions in quick succession: whether the contact had any measurement of the entity's physical capabilities beyond the initial impact data, and whether there was any indication the entity had made contact with Eren Yeager. Zeke said no to both. Pike said that the second question was more important than the first. Zeke agreed with her, which meant he had already been thinking about it. The possibility that Saitama and Eren occupied the same physical space before Marley had a framework for managing either of them was the specific scenario that made every other calculation secondary, because Eren's value to the Marleyan operation was contingent on his isolation, and the isolation was already compromised by something nobody had planned for. Porco Galliard, who held the Jaw Titan and whose relationship with strategic nuance was functional but not enthusiastic, asked the more direct question that the other two had been building toward without statting. Could the entity be killed? Zeke didn't answer immediately, which for him was unusual enough that both Pike and Porco noticed it. He said that the dispatch didn't provide data sufficient for a confident answer, and that the fact that the Survey Corps had not attempted any form of aggressive containment after 14 days of direct exposure suggested that people with far more observational data than the dispatch contained had already made their own assessment of that question and found it discouraging. Porco said that they should find out for themselves. Pike said that finding out for themselves was the exact methodology most likely to produce an outcome from which they could not recover, and that she would like to propose an alternative. Zeke told her to go ahead. What Pike proposed was an intelligence operation rather than a combat operation, which was the distinction that separated her thinking from Porco's in most situations. She wanted a direct observer inside Wall Rose, not the merchant contact who had no training, but someone with military assessment capability who could get close enough to Saitama to evaluate his actual behavioral patterns, his apparent limitations if any existed, and most critically his relationship with the Survey Corps leadership, because the nature of that relationship would determine whether the entity was operating independently, cooperatively, or under some form of informal constraint that might be exploitable. She said that the worst outcome was not that Saitama was undefeatable in direct combat, which they could work around strategically. The worst outcome was that Saitama was undefeatable and had formed a functional alliance with the Survey Corps, because that combination eliminated every tactical approach that Marley had developed over the past decade and left them building strategy on empty ground. Zeke listened to all of this and then sat with it for a moment the way he sat with things that were correct but incomplete. He said that Pike was right about the intelligence priority and right about the alliance risk, but that she was missing the variable that he kept returning to every time he worked through the situation from any angle. He stood up and walked to the map table and put his finger on the section that represented the territory between Wall Rose and Wall Maria, the open ground where the pure Titan population had been ranging for years as a resource and a barrier, and a constant tactical reality that shaped every decision both sides made. He said that according to the dispatch, and the follow-up information his contact had managed to gather, the pure Titan behavior in the outer territories had changed. They were ranging differently, the patterns were off. Something about Saitama's presence was registering in whatever collective instinct governed pure Titan movement, and if that was true, if the Titans themselves were responding to him as a threat category that superseded their baseline behavioral programming, then the question of whether Saitama could be killed was almost secondary to the question of what happened to Marley's entire tactical infrastructure on Parades if the pure Titan stopped functioning as a resource, because something had frightened them out of their operational patterns. He picked up the dispatch and folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. Then he told his commanders that they had 2 weeks to establish an observer inside Wall Rose, that the observer's primary mission was behavioral assessment, and secondary mission was identifying any exploitable friction between Saitama and the Survey Corps leadership, and that until the observer reported back no Marleyan operation on the island was to proceed with its previous timeline, because every timeline had been built on assumptions that were no longer verified. Pike nodded. Porco looked like he wanted to object and then didn't, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Zeke walked out of the tent into the dark of the southern forest and stood for a moment looking at the direction of the walls, invisible at this distance but present in the way they were always present, as a fixed point around which everything else had always been organized. He thought about the dispatch again. He thought about a man falling from the sky. He thought about 3 Titans erased by the force of a landing. And then he thought about what kind of world produced a man who found that unremarkable. And he understood for the first time in his adult life that he was strategizing around something he could not fully see, which was the specific condition he had spent his entire career engineering for his enemies and had never expected to experience himself. Nobody told Saitama he couldn't leave. That was the critical failure point that Erwin would identify later in his strategic post-assessment, not as a criticism of any specific decision, but as an example of how institutional frameworks collapse when confronted with variables they were never designed to contain. Every protocol the Survey Corps possessed for managing dangerous entities was built on the assumption that the entity in question had some vulnerability that could be leveraged into compliance, some threshold of force or consequence that produced behavioral modification. The entire architecture of military authority was constructed on that assumption so deeply that it had become invisible, the way load-bearing walls become invisible when you've lived in a building long enough. Nobody had written a protocol for an entity with no threshold, because nobody had needed one. And so, when Saitama woke up on the 17th day of his residence in Karen's, looked out the window at the open territory beyond Wall Rose, decided he was bored enough to take a walk, and simply left, there was no mechanism to stop him that anyone was willing to test. The soldier on gate duty saw him coming from 50 meters and sent a runner to Hange before Saitama reached the gate, which was the correct procedure, and the runner made good time. But Hange was on the other side of the district and good time wasn't fast enough. By the time she arrived at the gate, Saitama was already through it, and moving east across the open ground at a pace that looked like a casual walk, and was covering ground at a rate that didn't match that description at all. Because Saitama's casual walk was calibrated to a body that had no metabolic limit and no reason to conserve energy. And the soldiers who tried to pace him on horseback found that maintaining parallel movement required a trot rather than a walk, and that the gap between them widened whenever the terrain became uneven, because Saitama's stride adjusted automatically, and theirs required deliberate management. Hange went through the gate at a run and shouted his name, and he stopped and turned around, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had heard their name called and was checking whether it was something important. She asked where he was going. He said he was going to look around. She asked if he could wait for an escort. He looked at the open territory around him, the fields and the distant tree line and the sky, and then he looked back at Hange and asked what an escort would do. She opened her mouth and closed it again, because the honest answer was nothing, and Hange was constitutionally incapable of providing a dishonest answer to a direct question she found scientifically interesting, and the question of what an escort would functionally accomplish when accompanying someone who could not be threatened, guided, or protected was genuinely interesting to her in a way that temporarily overrode her operational concern. He waited for an answer for a few seconds and then turned and kept walking, and after a brief pause, Hange went after him, and Moblet went after Hange, and 3 soldiers went after Moblet with the particular resigned expression of people who have identified an outcome they cannot change, and have decided that being present for it is better than being absent. The first pure Titan they encountered was approximately 2 kilometers east of the wall, a 12-meter class that had been moving through a shallow depression in the ground, and emerged onto the flat terrain ahead of the group with the unhurried inevitability that pure Titans always moved with, its attention immediately locating the human figures and its body orienting toward them with the slow hydraulic certainty of something that had been doing this for years and had never had a reason to do it differently. Hange stopped. The soldiers behind her stopped. Saitama kept walking. The Titan took 3 steps toward him and then did something that Hange had never seen a pure Titan do in any of her years of field research. It stopped, not because something blocked it, not because it was distracted. It stopped with the particular mechanical uncertainty of a system encountering an input it wasn't designed to process, its huge head lowering slightly, its expression cycling through the limited range of pure Titan facial affect, and settling somewhere that Hange, who had spent more time than anyone alive studying Titan behavioral signals, identified with a jolt of genuine scientific shock as hesitation. The Titan stood at approximately 30 meters from Saitama and did not advance. Saitama looked up at it. He tilted his head slightly the way he tilted his head at things that were mildly interesting. Then he raised his hand and waved at it, a small casual gesture, the kind you make at a neighbor. The Titan stared at him. Then it turned and walked in the other direction, not running, not fleeing in any dramatic sense, just simply choosing a different direction with the abruptness of a decision being made by something that didn't have the cognitive architecture for the kind of fear it was nevertheless experiencing. Han made a sound that was not a word. She wrote in her notebook for 40 seconds without looking up. Moblet stood beside her with an expression suggesting he had stopped being surprised by things 30 minutes ago and had moved into a state of suspended processing, where he was simply recording events for later emotional engagement when he had the time. One of the soldiers said quietly to the other that the Titan had just walked away from a person, and the other soldier said yes, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't anything else to say that improved on the plain factual description of what had just happened. Saitama walked another 3 kilometers before the second encounter, which was different in nature and therefore in consequence. The second Titan was an abnormal, a 9-meter class that had been ranging erratically through the eastern fields in the pattern that characterized abnormals, unpredictable direction changes, sudden acceleration, behavior that didn't conform to the stimulus response model that made pure Titans predictable enough to manage. It came from the left at speed, not targeting the group behind Saitama, but targeting Saitama himself with the specific trajectory of an abnormal that had identified something it was moving toward for reasons that were internal and non-rational. It covered 50 meters in approximately 4 seconds. Saitama heard it coming, or perhaps felt it. The soldiers watching couldn't determine which, and turned to face it with the particular unhurried rotation of someone turning to look at something that has made a noise rather than something that is about to kill them. The Titan was mid-stride, leaning forward into its final approach, when Saitama raised one fist and punched it. The word punched is insufficient. The soldiers watching had seen ODM blades cut Titan napes. They had seen explosive charges deployed against Titan limbs. They had seen the colossal Titan steam strip flesh from bone at range. None of those things resembled what they saw when Saitama's fist connected with the abnormal Titan's torso. The Titan did not fall. It did not dissolve. It ceased at the point of contact to be a coherent physical object, and the force that passed through it continued outward in a straight line, and removed a section of the tree line 200 meters behind where the Titan had been standing with the completeness of an event, rather than an impact. The shockwave reached the group behind Saitama as a pressure wave that knocked 2 of the soldiers off their feet and sent Hange's notebook spinning from her hand. The sound arrived a fraction of a second later and was loud enough that Moblet's ears were ringing for the next 6 hours. Where the abnormal Titan had been, there was a dispersing cloud of steam, and at the center of it, Saitama was lowering his fist and looking at the gap in the tree line with mild interest. He said, to nobody in particular, that one had been a little faster than the others. Then he turned and looked back at the group and asked if everyone was okay. Hange was already scrambling to retrieve her notebook from the ground, her hair completely disordered, her glasses askew, an expression on her face that occupied the exact intersection of scientific rapture and existential crisis. She said she was fine and asked him to describe the internal sensation of the punch, because her existing models of force generation had just been comprehensively destroyed, and she was building new ones in real time. Saitama said there wasn't really an internal sensation, it was just a punch. Hange wrote this down. One of the soldiers, the one still on his feet, looked at the gap in the tree line for a long time and then looked at Saitama's fist, and then looked at the tree line again, performing the geometric calculation of what had just passed through 200 meters of forest and emerged the other side, and arrived at a number that he would later describe to his bunkmates as the moment he stopped being afraid of Titans entirely and started being afraid of something else. Behind the wall, the seismic monitoring equipment that the garrison had installed along Wall Rose's eastern face registered the impact as a mid-level seismic event. The duty officer who received the report checked the external patrol logs, found no record of Titan contact at scale, and filed an anomaly report that would reach Erwin's desk by evening, and would be the 4th piece of evidence that day confirming what he already knew. That Saitama, moving through the world at his own pace, and on his own initiative, was producing consequences at a rate and scale that no existing framework could track, let alone manage, and that the gap between what was happening and what anyone could do about it was widening every hour. Eren Yeager had been in the basement of a requisitioned building in the Trost district for 11 days when he first heard about Saitama, and he heard about it the way most information reached him during periods of restricted movement, through Armin, who had heard it from Hange, who had written a summary so dense with annotation and cross-referenced behavioral data that Armin had spent 2 hours reading it before distilling it into something communicable. Armin sat across from Eren in the dim light of the basement room with the summary in his hands, and gave him the essential facts in the careful sequential order he used when he was delivering information he expected to produce a strong reaction and wanted to minimize the time between delivery and understanding. An entity had arrived on Parades. He was human in presentation. He could not be hurt. He had eliminated Titans with his bare hands as a casual byproduct of existing in the world. The Survey Corps had not contained him because the Survey Corps could not contain him. He was currently walking through the Eastern Territories outside Wall Rose apparently because he felt like it. Eren listened to all of this without interrupting, which Armin noted because Eren's default response to new information was engagement before comprehension, a forward momentum that processed details through the filter of their implications for his goals before it processed them as facts. The silence meant the information was producing something more complicated than a reaction, and Armin waited it out. When Eren finally spoke, he didn't ask about Saitama's capabilities or his origins or his intentions. He asked where he was right now. Armin said he was in the Eastern Territories outside Wall Rose, approximately 4 kilometers from the gate, accompanied by Hange and a small field escort. Eren said nothing for another long moment, and then said that he wanted to meet him. Armin said that Eren's movement restrictions were still in effect, and that Erwin had specifically excluded him from the initial contact protocols. Eren looked at Armin with the expression he used when he had already decided something, and was communicating that the decision was made rather than inviting discussion of its merits. Armin looked back at him, and then looked at the door, and then looked back at Eren, and said that he was going to go get water, and that he would be back in 15 minutes, and that whatever happened in those 15 minutes was not something he had any foreknowledge of or responsibility for. Eren stood up before Armin had finished the sentence. He moved through Trost, using the root knowledge he had built over years of moving through districts under conditions where being seen was a problem, staying below rooflines, using the service corridors between market buildings, cutting through the stable yards that connected the inner and outer sections of the settlement. He reached the eastern gate in 20 minutes and talked his way through it in 3, not through deception, but through the particular quality of Eren's presence in those years, the weight of what everyone around him knew he carried, and the way that weight created a space around him that authority figures found difficult to fill with a direct no. The soldier on the gate hesitated for 4 seconds, and then opened the smaller access door, and Eren went through it and out into the open territory with the sun at midday, and the sound of Trost behind him, and ahead of him the flat eastern ground, and somewhere on it, a man who had arrived from nowhere and could do what no Titan, no soldier, no power Eren had encountered could do, which was make everything else seem small. He found them by the sound first, or rather by the absence of sound, the particular stillness that had settled over a section of the eastern field that told him something significant had recently happened there. Then he found them by sight, Hange's silhouette bent over her notebook, Moblet standing nearby, 2 soldiers in various states of recovery, and in the center of the group, a short figure in a white cape, standing with his hands in his pockets looking at a gap in the tree line where trees had recently been. Eren approached, and Hange saw him first, and her expression cycled rapidly through surprise, disapproval, and scientific interest before settling on a pragmatic resignation that acknowledged the situation had developed faster than any of her objections could address. She said his name in a tone that contained all 3 of those responses simultaneously. Eren ignored the tone and kept walking toward Saitama. Saitama heard him coming and turned around, and for a moment the 2 of them were simply looking at each other across 10 meters of open ground. Eren, whose entire existence had been defined by the Titans and the walls and the inheritance of a power that was destroying him from the inside on a biological clock he couldn't stop, and Saitama, who had arrived here from a world where the most powerful things in it had already been insufficient, and who was looking at Eren with the mild attentiveness he directed at new people before determining whether they were interesting. Eren closed the distance to 5 meters and stopped. He said that Saitama had killed 3 Titans with his landing. Saitama said yes. Eren said that he could transform into a Titan himself, that he was a Titan shifter, and that he had abilities beyond the basic transformation. Saitama received this information with a small nod that indicated he was filing it. Eren said that he had been trying to find a way to defeat the Titans for his entire life, and that everything he had done, every sacrifice that had been made around him, had been in service of that objective. Saitama said that sounded hard. Eren looked at him. He said that Saitama could end it, right now immediately, without strategy or sacrifice or the political machinery that had been grinding people up for years. He could simply go out into the world and remove every Titan from it, and everything that had been built on the foundation of that threat. The walls, the class system, the military police's interior power, the Marleyan operation, all of it would collapse, and something different could be built in the space that was left. Saitama listened to this and was quiet for a moment, and then asked Eren how many Titans there were. Eren said he didn't know the exact number, that there were pure Titans across the territories and Titan shifters within various factions, and the rumbling, which was the wall Titans, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Saitama was quiet again for longer this time, and then he said that hundreds of thousands was a lot, and his tone contained a quality that Eren did not expect and could not immediately categorize, because it was not reluctance, and it was not excitement, and it was not fear. It was the tone of someone doing arithmetic on a problem, and finding that the arithmetic came out fine, but the answer didn't make them feel anything in particular. Hange had stopped writing and was watching this conversation with the intensity she applied to experiments at their critical juncture. She had heard Erwin's strategic reasoning about relationship management versus asset management, and she agreed with it analytically. But watching Eren and Saitama across 10 meters of open ground, she was processing something that the strategic framing didn't fully capture. Eren was trying to give Saitama a reason, a framework, a cause to attach his capability to, and Saitama was receiving it with complete calm and complete distance, and the distance was not hostility but something more disorienting. It was the distance of someone who had been given reasons before, had acted on them, and had found that the reasons didn't fill the space inside him that he had hoped they would. She wrote one line in her notebook and underlined it twice. She wrote, "He is not looking for a cause. He is looking for a fight worth having." Eren said one more thing. He said that if Saitama wanted a real fight, something that would actually require him to push himself, the things inside the walls were not it. But the thing at the center of it all, the power at the origin of every Titan, the founding Titan and what it represented, that was something neither of them fully understood yet, and neither of them could fully predict. Saitama looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not with any of the volcanic emotional movement that characterized Eren's face, but a small specific shift that Hange caught because she had been watching his face for 17 days and had learned its vocabulary. His eyes moved from the middle-distance focus of someone listening politely to the slightly sharper focus of someone who has just heard a word that means something to them. He asked Eren what the founding Titan was. And Eren, for the first time since arriving, smiled. The Wall Titans moved on a Thursday. Nobody in the military command structure had predicted the timing, not because the intelligence had failed, but because the intelligence had been correctly interpreted and correctly escalated, and the response framework had simply not been fast enough. Which was the particular failure mode that Erwin had been trying to prevent for 3 weeks, and had been unable to prevent because the political machinery between correct assessment and authorized action had too many moving parts and too many people whose first priority was not the outcome, but their position relative to it. The seismic monitors along all 3 walls registered the preliminary movement simultaneously at 4 in the morning, a deep resonant vibration that the duty officers initially logged as geological until the magnitude continued escalating, and the pattern resolved into something rhythmic, something with the regularity of intent rather than the irregularity of natural process. By the time the first Wall Titan breached the surface of Wall Maria's outer face, the sun was coming up and the soldiers on the wall's crown were already running. The wall titans were not like the pure titans of the territories. They were not like the colossal titan that had broken Wall Maria years before, and whose memory had shaped a generation's understanding of scale and threat. They were older than any of those categories, older than the military structures that had been built in response to them, older than the walls themselves in the sense that they were the walls, the substance, and the architecture simultaneously. And when they began to move, the walls did not fall so much as transform. The stone and mortar that had defined the boundary of the habitable world for a century, simply ceasing to be stone and mortar as the bodies that had been compressed inside it remembered their original form. The sound it made was not an explosion. It was a long, continuous grinding that built over minutes into something that had no precedent in any auditory memory of anyone alive. The sound of a boundary condition being removed, the sound of a world losing its edges. Saitama was standing on the roof of a building in Cairns when it started. He had developed the habit of sitting on rooftops in the evenings and occasionally sleeping there, which the soldiers assigned to passive observation had noted in their logs without commentary, because there was no protocol category for it, and adding commentary would have required inventing one. He was awake and watching the direction of Wall Maria when the first tremor moved through the ground, and up through the building's structure, and into the soles of his feet. He looked at the horizon. The sky above Wall Maria's direction was changing color in a way that had nothing to do with the time of day, a pale luminous gray that spread along the wall's line from north to south with the systematic progression of something coordinated rather than something catastrophic. He watched it for a moment. Then he stepped off the roof, fell 3 stories, landed without a sound, and began walking toward it. In the Survey Corps command post in Trost, the reports were arriving faster than they could be processed, and the command structure was experiencing the specific crisis of an institution, receiving more simultaneous inputs than its decision architecture could handle. Erwin was at the central map table with 4 aides and Hange and 2 senior garrison officers, and the information coming in from the wall monitors was producing a picture so far outside the existing strategic framework that the language being used to describe it kept breaking down at the edges. Officers reaching for military terminology and finding it insufficient and substituting civilian language that was more accurate but carried none of the authority that military terminology was supposed to provide. Hange was cross-referencing the seismic data with her behavioral notes from the past 3 weeks, and arriving at a conclusion she had been developing incrementally since the night Eren and Saitama had talked in the eastern field, a conclusion that was now resolving from theoretical to verified in real time. She said it out loud to the room, because the room needed to hear it regardless of whether the room was ready for it. She said that the rumbling had begun, that the wall titans were active and moving, and that the projected impact radius of a full rumbling event encompassed every settlement inside the walls and extended significantly beyond them. Erwin said that he knew. She said that Saitama was already moving toward it. Erwin said that he knew that too. Levi was on horseback 3 kilometers north of Trost when the tremors started, and he had oriented toward Wall Maria before the second tremor finished, not because he had received any communication, but because the direction and character of the vibration told him enough, and his body had learned over years to move toward the thing that was happening rather than away from it, because away from it was where you lost people, and toward it was where you had any chance of affecting anything. He pushed his horse to a gallop and sent a rider back to Trost with a message for Erwin that said the same thing Han had just said to the room, in 4 words rather than 40, and arrived at the eastern approach to Wall Maria's inner face in time to see something that restructured his understanding of scale in a way that his understanding of scale had not been restructured since the first time he had seen the colossal titan. The wall titans were enormous in a way that the word enormous was not equipped to convey. The colossal titan was 60 meters. The wall titans were closer to 50, but they were everywhere, emerging from the wall's full length simultaneously, Not one event, but a continuous event. Hundreds of bodies breaching stone that had held them for a century. The wall's surface splitting along lines that had always been there but invisible. The Titans pulling themselves free with a slow, massive inevitability that made every previous military threat look like something that could be addressed with enough personnel and enough blades. Levi stopped his horse at the edge of a ridge that gave him a line of sight along 2 kilometers of the wall's outer face, and watched 3 wall Titans complete their emergence and begin to move. His horse was trembling under him. He was not. But his calculation of outcomes was running at a speed he usually reserved for close combat situations where the margin was narrow and the options were narrowing further. And what it was producing was the first assessment he had made in years that arrived at the conclusion. There is nothing here that I can cut. Saitama arrived at the outer face of Wall Maria 40 minutes after leaving Karen's, which was faster than a horse could cover the distance, and had required him to move at something approaching his actual travel pace. Rather than the casual walk, he had been maintaining out of the general courtesy of not leaving everyone behind. He stood at the base of the wall and looked up at the wall Titans emerging above him, bodies the size of buildings pulling themselves free of stone with a noise that was felt more than heard at this proximity. And the expression on his face was not fear, and not awe, and not the particular excitement that the soldiers who had followed him on horseback at a desperate gallop would later say they had hoped to see. It was the expression of someone who has arrived at the thing they came for and is taking its measure before deciding how to proceed. He tilted his head back to track the full height of the nearest wall Titan, which was still in the process of extracting itself from the wall's face with the slow hydraulic power of something that had been waiting a very long time to move. He noted its size. He noted the number of others visible along the wall's line. He made the calculation that Levi had made from the ridge, but arrived at a different conclusion. Because Levi's calculation was constrained by what Levi could do, and Saitama's calculation was not constrained by anything. He picked the nearest one. It was mid-emergence, its lower body still embedded in the wall structure, its upper body free and beginning to orient toward the territory below with the slow, deliberate movement of something that had direction but not yet speed. Saitama looked at it the way he looked at all of them, with the measuring attentiveness that preceded action, and then he bent his knees slightly and jumped. He reached the Titan's face in approximately 1 second, and the punch he delivered was not the same punch he had given the abnormal in the eastern field, the casual mid-stride response that had more than sufficed for something 9 meters tall. This punch was intentional in the specific sense that he had chosen to apply more force than default, not because the Titan required it, but because he had learned from the abnormal encounter that the default force had consequences for the surrounding environment, and he was standing next to a wall full of people, and wanted the consequence to go in one direction rather than several. The wall Titan's head did not dissolve. It was removed from the wall Titan's body at a velocity that carried it approximately 2 kilometers into the territory outside the wall before it began to break apart, and the body below it, the vast embedded mass of it, went still with the abruptness of a machine losing power, the slow movement ceasing immediately and completely. The wall Titans nearest to the impact site registered the event, not in any way that suggested cognitive awareness, but in the way that a system registers a disruption to its operational parameters, a momentary hesitation in the movement that had been building for the past hour, a pause in the emergence process along a 300-meter section of wall on either side of the impact. It lasted 4 seconds. Then they continued. Saitama landed, looked up at the wall's line, and counted. There were more of them than the abnormals in the eastern field. There were more of them than anything he had encountered since arriving in this world. He felt, for the first time in what might have been years, something that was not quite anticipation but occupied the same general neighborhood. He said, quietly and to himself, that this might take a minute. The first hour was systematic. That was the word Hange used in her field notes, written on horseback at a gallop with handwriting that deteriorated progressively as the horse's pace increased but remained legible, because she had trained herself to write under conditions that would have made most people stop trying. Systematic. Saitama moved along the base of Wall Maria's outer face from south to north, and he dealt with the wall titans in the sequence they presented themselves, which was the sequence of their emergence, the ones furthest along in the extraction process receiving his attention first, and the ones still mid-breach receiving it when he looped back. He was not running. He was not sprinting in any recognizable athletic sense. He moved between targets at a pace that covered ground faster than a horse at full gallop, and did so with the unhurried quality of someone walking a route they have decided to complete rather than racing against a deadline. Each wall titan he reached was handled in the same way. A single punch, calibrated, directed outward away from the wall's inner face to send the consequence into the open territory rather than back into the settlements. The calibration was not strategic in the sense that Erwin would have used the word. It was practical in the way that a person is practical when they are doing a task that requires awareness of the space they are working in. Levi watched from the ridge for the first 20 minutes and then moved his horse north to maintain a line of sight as Saitama progressed along the wall. The horse had stopped trembling somewhere in the second or third engagement, as if the animal's nervous system had made a decision to stop processing what it was witnessing as a threat category and simply accept it as the current condition of the world. Levi understood this. He had made the same adjustment himself, not emotionally but functionally, the part of him that allocated cognitive resources to threat assessment having quietly redirected those resources to documentation, because threat assessment had returned a result that required no ongoing revision. He counted the wall titans as they fell. He noted the time between engagements. He noted the direction of the displaced mass. He noted the effect on the surrounding terrain, which was considerable, the open fields outside Wall Maria's outer face, accumulating a geography of impact craters and displaced earth that would take years to fully map. He was doing this because documentation was the only contribution available to him, and Levi was not a person who accepted irrelevance without finding an adjacent function to occupy. The soldiers who had followed Saitama from Karen's had stopped at the base of the wall when the scale of the engagement became clear, not from fear in any simple sense, but from the same cognitive adjustment that Levi had made, the recognition that the appropriate role for every human being within range of this event was witness rather than participant. They stood in a loose group on the inner face of the wall's territory and watched through the gate observation slits and the wall's crown parapets as the sound of each impact traveled through the stone beneath their feet like a second pulse, steady and rhythmic, and increasingly rapid as Saitama found his pace, and the wall titans nearest him began to register his approach in whatever collective sensory field governed their movement, because they did register it. By the 40th minute of the engagement, the emergence pattern along Wall Maria's northern section had changed. The wall titans there were not pausing. They were accelerating, pulling themselves free faster than the structural physics of their extraction should have allowed, not fleeing because wall titans did not flee. They were not capable of it in the way pure titans were not capable of choosing not to eat, but something in the distributed intelligence that connected them was responding to the systematic removal of their number by adjusting the operational tempo. And the adjustment was visible and measurable and deeply unsettling to every military observer watching from the wall's crown. Hange reached Erwin by messenger relay at the 90-minute mark with a field assessment that Erwin read 3 times in 60 seconds, and then passed to his senior aide with the instruction to have it copied and distributed to every command post between Trost and the northern garrison immediately. The assessment said that Saitama had neutralized 63 wall titans in 90 minutes, that the pace was accelerating rather than declining, that there was no observable indication of fatigue or physical limitation, and that the wall titan population's behavioral response suggested a distributed awareness of the engagement that had no precedent in any documented titan behavior. The assessment also said, in a paragraph that Erwin's aide would later describe as the most precise piece of military writing he had ever transcribed, that the strategic implications of a successful single-entity elimination of the wall titan population were not simply tactical but civilizational, that the wall titans had functioned simultaneously as a threat and as the foundational premise of every political and social structure that had developed inside the walls over the past century, and that their removal would not liberate the existing order but dissolve it, because the existing order had been built in response to them and had no load-bearing structure independent of that response. The walls coming down would not free the people inside them. It would leave them standing in open ground without the walls or the institutions the walls had generated, and what grew in that space was not predictable from any existing model. Eren was on the wall's crown when the second hour began. He had arrived via a route that nobody had formally authorized, and that 3 separate soldiers had technically failed to prevent, which was a pattern in Eren's relationship with institutional authority that had been consistent since childhood. He stood at the parapet with his hands on the stone and watched Saitama work, and the expression on his face was not what any of the soldiers near him expected, because they expected elation or vindication, or the fierce satisfaction of someone watching a goal approached at speed. What they saw instead was something quieter and more complicated, a stillness that sat behind his eyes like water that had stopped moving, and the soldiers who knew Eren best, which meant the soldiers who had survived long enough to observe the full range of his emotional expression, recognized it as the expression he wore when he was processing something that was happening exactly as he had in some way wanted it to, and finding that the wanting had not prepared him for what the happening actually felt like. Because the wall titans were dying, not metaphorically, not strategically, not in the way that military victories produced abstract shifts in power. They were being removed from the world one by a force that had no relationship to the conflict that had generated them, no history with Eldia or Marley or the power of the Titans, no investment in the outcome beyond the basic purposefulness of a person doing a task they had decided to do. And with each one that fell, Eren felt something moving inside his own body, the connection that existed between the founding Titan and the wall Titans, the inherited thread of the power of the Titans that ran through him and through them simultaneously, pulling tighter and then releasing, tighter and releasing, as each wall Titan's life ended and its contribution to the network of Titan power collapsed inward. It was not pain. It was more like the feeling of a rope being cut one fiber at a time, each cut individually minor, but the cumulative effect of many cuts building toward a threshold he could feel approaching without being able to identify precisely where it was. Armin found him on the wall's crown at the 2-hour mark and stood beside him without speaking for several minutes. Then Armin said that the Eastern Gate reports were estimating 214 wall titans neutralized in the first 2 hours, and that the projection based on current pace suggested the full population of the southern wall Maria section could be cleared in another 3 hours. Eren said nothing. Armin said that the military command was attempting to reach Saitama through Hange to ask whether he intended to continue along the wall's full perimeter, including Wall Rose and Wall Sina, and that there had been no response yet because Hange was in the field and the relay was slow. Eren said that Saitama would go wherever he decided to go, and that no message from the command structure was going to change that, and Armin said that he knew, and that the question had been sent anyway because institutions needed to be seen attempting to manage situations even when everyone involved understood the attempt was primarily symbolic. Eren looked at him. Armin said that he had been paying attention during the political sessions. Eren almost smiled. The 3rd hour brought a change that Levi documented from his northern observation point, and that reached Erwin 40 minutes after it began, carried by a rider who delivered it in person because the relay stations along the northern approach were not functioning, the wall titan emergence in that section having disrupted the infrastructure when the bodies came through. What Levi reported was this: the wall titans in the northern section were not emerging. They were present, the seismic readings confirmed it, the wall's surface showed the stress fractures of bodies preparing to breach, but the breach was not completing. Something in the collective field that connected them was holding the northern population in a state of suspended emergence, the preparation without the follow-through, and the pattern had started approximately 40 minutes into Saitama's engagement with the southern section and had intensified as his progress continued. Levi's assessment, written in his characteristically minimal style at the bottom of the report, was 4 words. He wrote, "They are waiting for something." Erwin read this and sat down and thought about what a distributed intelligence built on a century of accumulated Titan power might be waiting for, and arrived at an answer that he immediately wished he hadn't, because it was the answer that made everything else that had happened in the past 3 weeks resolve into a coherent shape, and the shape it formed was the outline of a confrontation that no military strategy on Earth could position anyone favorably for. The wall titans were waiting, and Saitama was walking north. The northern wall titans emerged all at once. Not in the sequential pattern of the southern section, not with the individual rhythms of bodies extracting themselves from stone at their own pace, but simultaneously, the entire northern face of Wall Maria splitting along its full length in a single event that lasted less than 4 seconds and produced a sound that reached Trost, 40 kilometers south, as a pressure change rather than a noise. A momentary compression of the air that made every person in the city stop what they were doing and look north without knowing why. The wall did not fall in pieces. It fell as a surface, the stone face shearing away in massive sections as the bodies behind it completed their emergence in concert, and the ground outside the wall's northern face received the displaced mass of 300 wall titans becoming fully mobile simultaneously, with a seismic impact that the monitoring equipment in Trost registered as the largest event in recorded history before the equipment itself was damaged by the secondary tremors and stopped recording. Saitama stopped. He was 4 kilometers into the northern section, had cleared approximately 60 wall titans from the northern approach before the simultaneous emergence began, and he stood in the field outside the wall's newly opened face and looked at what was in front of him with the specific quality of attention he applied to things that had finally become interesting. 300 wall titans, fully emerged, fully mobile, oriented in his direction with a coordination that pure titans did not possess, and that these titans should not have possessed either, moving toward him in a mass that covered the ground from the wall's broken face to the horizon in every direction that mattered. They were not running, they were walking. But they were walking together, and the ground under Saitama's feet was vibrating with a continuous low frequency that was the accumulated footfall of their approach. And the sky above the northern section had taken on the pale luminous quality that Saitama had first observed from the rooftop in Karen's, except now it was directly overhead, and the source of it was not atmospheric but biological. The faint collective radiance of Titan bodies at scale producing light as a byproduct of their existence, the way a city produces light as a byproduct of its density. Then the ground between the wall titans and Saitama opened, not from seismic activity, from something rising through it, something that had been beneath the earth in the space between the wall's foundation and the northern territory, something that had been waiting inside the ground the way the wall titans had been waiting inside the stone. The earth split in a line that ran from east to west, and the thing that came through it was larger than the wall titans by an order that made the wall titans look like the intermediate scale between human and titan rather than the largest scale available. It came through the ground slowly, with a deliberateness that was different from the wall titans' mechanical emergence, because it was not extracting itself from containment. It was arriving. There is a distinction between those two things, and the distinction was visible in every aspect of how it moved. The unhurried authority of something that had chosen this moment rather than been freed into it. The founding titan was enormous in a way that required new arithmetic. Its skeletal structure was visible through its body in the way that very large titans sometimes showed their underlying form, but where other titans of this type appeared incomplete, unfinished, the founding titan's visible structure read as intentional. The bones not exposed but present. The architecture of the body made legible rather than hidden, because nothing about this thing needed the concealment that smaller things used as protection. Its eyes, when they oriented toward Saitama, were not the blank hunting focus of pure titans, or even the directed intelligence of titan shifters. They were something older than either of those categories, something that had been watching the world from inside its own containment for long enough to understand it completely, and find that understanding neither comforting nor distressing, but simply factual. It looked at Saitama the way Saitama looked at everything, with a measuring quality, a taking of dimensions, an assessment conducted at a register below language. Levi, from his observation ridge 4 kilometers east, looked at the founding titan and then looked at Saitama, a figure so small at this distance that Levi had to consciously resist the perceptual error of losing him against the ground. He had his scope up, and he tracked between the two subjects with the methodical attention of a man who understood that what he was witnessing was the terminal event of everything that had been building since a bald man fell out of the sky and made a crater outside Wall Rose, and that his job in this moment was to see it clearly and completely because someone needed to, and he was the person positioned to do it. He noted the founding titan's dimensions as precisely as his scope allowed. He noted Saitama's posture, which had not changed. He noted that the wall titans in the surrounding field had stopped advancing and formed a perimeter at a distance of approximately 200 meters from the founding titan's position, which he interpreted as a deferential arrangement, the surrounding force yielding the engagement to the central authority. He thought about what Erwin had written at the top of his strategic assessment 3 weeks ago. What does this change, and for whom, and how fast? He thought that in approximately the next few minutes, all 3 parts of that question were going to receive their final answers. Eren felt it in his chest when the founding titan fully emerged, a resonance that moved through the inherited power inside him like a vibration moving through a string that had been plucked at a distance. He was still on the wall's crown in the Trost section, 50 kilometers from the engagement, and he felt it that clearly, which told him something about the scale of what had risen that the distance alone did not communicate adequately. Armin was beside him and felt nothing because Armin had no titan inheritance, and the resonance was not physical. It was something that existed in the space between the power of the titans and the bodies that carried it. Eren pressed his hand flat against the wall's stone surface, and the wall titans embedded in the sections near him responded. A faint involuntary movement, a tremor in the stone that had nothing to do with the seismic activity to the north and everything to do with the signal moving through the network that connected them all. He took his hand away. He said to Armin quietly that the founding titan was not trying to kill Saitama. Armin asked how he knew. Eren said that if it wanted to kill Saitama, it would have used the wall titans as a wave, sent them all simultaneously at once, overwhelmed the space around him rather than forming a perimeter. It had arranged them as a frame. It was presenting itself. It was trying to communicate something, or to measure something, or to make Saitama understand the scale of what it was before whatever came next. Armin was quiet for a moment, and then said that sounded like something a person would do. Eren said yes. The founding titan lowered itself into something that was not quite a crouch, but involved a reduction in its presented height that changed its posture from vertical dominance to something more ambiguous, and it looked at Saitama for a long time without moving. Saitama looked back at it. The wall titans in the surrounding perimeter were still. The pale light above the northern section had intensified to the point where it was visible in Trost as a glow on the northern horizon, and the soldiers on the wall's crown were describing it to each other in the instinctive language people use for things that exceed their existing descriptive vocabulary, reaching for analogies from memory and finding all of them insufficient. Hange had reached a position 2 kilometers south of the engagement and had her scope up and her notebook open, and was writing with a speed that suggested she had stopped waiting for comprehension to precede documentation, and was simply recording everything and trusting that comprehension would arrive later when the event was over and she had time to sit with what she had seen. Saitama scratched the back of his head. It was the same gesture he had made in Karen's when the laborer had asked him whether he could kill all the Titans, the unconscious physical response to a question or a situation that required him to actually consider something rather than simply respond to it. He looked at the founding Titan's face, at the eyes that were looking back at him with that ancient measuring quality, and he appeared to reach a conclusion. He bent his knees. The ground around his feet cracked from the pressure of his stance, a ring of fractures spreading outward 2 meters in every direction, and the wall Titans in the perimeter took a collective half-step back that they did not appear to intend. He did not jump immediately. He held the position for a moment, and in that moment every person watching from every observation point and parapet and ridge across the northern territory held their breath with the particular involuntary synchrony of people watching something they understand is about to be irreversible, something that once it begins cannot be recalled or redirected or stopped before it reaches its conclusion. Then he jumped, and the ground where he had been standing ceased to be flat ground, and the air above it folded closed behind him as he rose, and every seismic monitor between Trost and the northern wall that was still functioning registered the launch as an impact event, because the force required to accelerate a human body to the velocity Saitama achieved in a standing jump was indistinguishable from an explosion at the measurement scale available. And the shockwave that followed him upward bent the pale light above the northern section sideways before it recovered. The founding Titan looked up, and for the first time in a century of accumulated waiting, in all the long geological patience of something that had existed inside stone and known, it would one day emerge into a world that would receive it as an absolute power. The founding Titan looked at the thing coming toward it, and contained within that ancient measuring, gazed something that had not been there before. Not fear, not in any simple sense, but the specific recalibration of a system encountering a variable it had not included in its model of the world, and finding that the model required revision in real time, under conditions that did not permit revision. Levi lowered his scope. He had tracked Saitama's ascent for as long as the scope's range allowed, and then lost him against the sky. He sat on his stationary horse in the still field, and listened to the sound that was coming from the north. A sound that started low and built rapidly through registers that the human ear processed sequentially from feeling to hearing to something beyond either. And he thought about the Survey Corps and the walls and the years of people who had died in the space between what they were and what the world required of them. He thought about Erwin. He thought about all the names he carried. Then the sound from the north peaked, and the pale light above the horizon went briefly and completely white, and the ground moved beneath his horse's feet in a single massive pulse. And then everything was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The quiet of an event concluded rather than an event anticipated, and Levi looked at the northern sky and waited. The light faded over 3 minutes, not all at once, not with the abruptness of a switch, but in the gradual way that significant illumination fades when its source has been removed, and the atmosphere is still processing the residual energy of what produced it. The northern sky went from white to pale gold to the ordinary gray of a cloudy morning, and the soldiers on Wall Rose's crown who had been watching it watched the transition with the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something that has permanently rearranged the interior furniture of their understanding of what the world is and what it contains. Nobody spoke for a long time after the light finished fading. Then someone, a young soldier whose name nobody recorded because in the moment nobody thought to ask, said that the ground had stopped moving. It was true. The continuous low-frequency vibration that had been present in the Earth since the wall titans began their emergence 3.5 hours earlier had ceased, and its absence was something the body registered before the mind did. A stillness in the soles of the feet that traveled upward and became a stillness in the chest. And in that stillness was the first moment of silence that the world inside the walls had experienced since before anyone currently alive had been born. Levi rode north. He rode at a pace that was faster than necessary for reconnaissance and slower than what urgency would have demanded, which was the pace of a person who needed to see something but was also preparing themselves to see it, making space in the approach for the processing that would be required when the destination arrived. He covered the 4 kilometers in 12 minutes and crested the low ridge that had been his observation point and looked at the northern territory, and what he saw required him to stop his horse and sit with it for a full minute before he could begin to organize it into anything reportable. The wall was gone, not fallen in the way that Wall Maria had fallen years before, damaged and breached and still structurally present in the sections that hadn't been destroyed. Gone. The wall titans had fully emerged, and their emergence had been the wall, and the wall titans were no longer standing. They were on the ground across the northern territory in a distribution that covered the landscape from horizon to horizon, not scattered like defeated combatants, but arranged in the specific pattern of things that had simply stopped, the cessation of animation rather than the aftermath of violence, and the steam that rose from them was already thinning in the morning air, the dissolution process completing faster than it did for pure titans. As if the power that had sustained them for a century was releasing all at once rather than gradually. At the center of the territory, where the founding titan had risen, there was a crater. It was larger than the one Saitama had made outside Wall Rose on the first day, larger by a factor that Levi could not accurately estimate from the ridge, because the scale exceeded his reference points, the kind of scale that required aerial observation or mathematical projection to properly measure. The founding titan was not in it. Nothing the size of the founding titan was anywhere in the northern territory that Levi could see, and he looked carefully and for a long time, because things the size of the founding titan do not simply cease to be present in a landscape without leaving an indication of where they went. What he found instead at the crater's near edge was a small figure sitting on a rock. Saitama was sitting on a rock at the edge of the largest crater in recorded human history, elbows on his knees, chin in his hands, looking at the middle distance with the expression he had been wearing since the first day, the expression that had no specific name in any emotional vocabulary Levi possessed, but that he had learned over 3 weeks to read as the aftermath of an engagement that had ended too quickly to produce satisfaction. Levi descended from the ridge and crossed the territory at a walk, threading between the fallen wall titans and the dispersing steam, and arrived at the crater's edge and dismounted and stood at a distance of approximately 10 meters from Saitama and looked at the crater for a while before looking at Saitama. He asked if it was done. Saitama said yes. Levi asked about the founding titan. Saitama said it was done too. Levi asked if that was all. Saitama looked at him and said that the founding titan had been the most durable thing he'd encountered since arriving, which was why the crater was the size it was. But that durable wasn't the same as difficult, not in the sense that Saitama used that word, and that the difference between those two things was something he had stopped expecting the world to resolve in his favor a long time ago. Levi looked at him for a moment and then sat down on the ground next to the rock, not beside Saitama exactly, but close enough that the conversation could continue without either of them raising their voice. And for a while neither of them said anything, and the steam from the fallen wall titans moved through the space between them in the morning air. The reports reached Erwin over the following 6 hours in the order that the relay stations recovered their function, and he read them in sequence and built the picture they described with the methodical precision of a man who had been building pictures from incomplete information for his entire adult life, and had learned that the picture was always clearer when you waited for the pieces to arrive in order rather than filling the gaps with inference. What the pieces described assembled was this: the wall Titan population was neutralized. The founding Titan was neutralized. The pure Titans in the outer territories were in retreat, moving away from the walls in every direction with the behavioral pattern that had been observed in smaller form during Saitama's eastern walk 3 weeks earlier. Dispersal rather than directed movement, the absence of prey drive, the particular behavioral signature of things that had lost the organizing principle of their existence and were moving through a world they no longer had instructions for. The walls themselves, all 3 of them, were structurally compromised in their northern sections to the point of non-function as defensive structures. They remained standing in their southern sections, but the gaps in the north were permanent and large, and the territory beyond them was open to the outside world in a way it had not been in a century. Erwin sat with this picture for a long time. Then he wrote 3 documents. The first was a military assessment of the immediate security situation, which was that the Titan threat to the population inside the walls had been reduced from existential to manageable, that the remaining pure Titan population in the outer territories was dispersing rather than consolidating, and that the primary security concern in the short term was not Titans, but the political and social consequences of the wall's partial destruction and the power vacuum created by the removal of the threat that had structured every institution inside them. The second document was a communication to the royal government, informing them that their strategic framework was no longer applicable, and that new governance structures would need to be developed from first principles. A communication he worded with diplomatic precision, while being fully aware that what he was actually telling them was that they were obsolete, and that the process of becoming obsolete had already begun without their authorization. The third document was a personal letter that he did not address to any institution or rank but simply to a name, and it was short, and he sealed it before anyone could see it, and later nobody could confirm who it had been addressed to, though Han had a strong suspicion. Hanja's own documentation from the event ran to 47 pages by the end of the first day, and she was not finished. She had recorded everything she could observe from her position 2 kilometers south of the engagement, had gathered testimony from every soldier she could find who had a line of sight to any portion of the founding Titan encounter, and was in the process of constructing an account that she was already aware would be the foundational document of whatever scientific understanding humanity eventually developed about what had happened in the Northern Territory on that morning. She worked through the night and into the next day without sleeping, which was not unusual for Hanj during periods of significant discovery, and the account she produced was precise and comprehensive and contained within it, buried in the technical language of behavioral observation and force measurement and structural analysis, something that was not a scientific finding but a personal one, something she had concluded in the hours of documentation and reflection, and that she included in a single paragraph near the end of the account almost as a footnote. She wrote that the entity designated Saitama had eliminated the complete Titan threat to Paradise Island in a single engagement lasting approximately 4 hours, and that in doing so, he had resolved the central conflict of human civilization in this world in a time frame and manner that no human institution had planned for, prepared for, or could claim any credit for, and that the appropriate response to this fact was not strategic assessment, but a particular kind of honesty, which was that humanity had been saved not by its own effort or intelligence or sacrifice, but by the arrival of something from outside the world that found the world's greatest threat to be insufficient, and that this was simultaneously the best possible outcome and the most humbling thing that had ever happened to the species. Saitama left Karen's on the morning of the 4th day after the founding Titan's defeat, not formally, not with any communication to the Survey Corps or the military command or Hanj, who would have wanted to document the departure with the same thoroughness she had documented everything else. He simply got up before sunrise and walked to the gate and went through it, and the soldier on duty, who was new enough to the post that he hadn't been present for any of the preceding events and only knew Saitama by the description that had been circulating through the barracks for weeks, stood at the gate and watched him go and did not move to stop him and did not know whether he should have. He sent a report up the chain in the standard format, logging an unscheduled departure of a non-military entity through the eastern gate at 0530, and the report traveled up the chain and reached Erwin's desk by mid-morning, and Erwin read it and held it for a moment, and then placed it in the folder that contained everything else from the past 4 weeks, and set the folder on the shelf behind his desk, where he kept the documents that were finished. Eren heard about it from Armin by midday. He was in the courtyard of the requisition building when Armin told him, sitting in the sun with his back against the wall, and he received the information without visible reaction for a long time. Then he asked which direction Saitama had gone. Armin said east, into the open territory, away from all the walls. Eren looked at the sky for a while. He said that he thought Saitama had probably hoped the founding Titan would be harder. Armin said that he had thought the same thing. Eren said that there was something specifically lonely about being the strongest thing in a world, about arriving somewhere and finding out that the most significant challenge it offered wasn't enough to fill the space where a real fight would have gone, and that he understood this not because he had experienced it, but because he had spent his entire life in the opposite position, fighting from a place of absolute deficiency against things that exceeded him. And the loneliness of that position was something he knew intimately, and he thought the mirror version of it, the loneliness of the position Saitama occupied, was probably not that different in the way it felt from the inside. Armin didn't say anything. Eren looked back down from the sky and at the courtyard and at the new ordinary morning of a world that had no titans in it for the first time in a century, the world he had wanted his whole life, the world that was here now, and he tried to feel what he had always expected to feel when it arrived. He felt the morning. He felt the sun. He felt the absence of what had always been there. That was what it was. That was what it had become. Somewhere east of the broken wall, in the open territory that had been Titan ground for as long as anyone could remember and was now just ground, a bald man in a white cape walked through the morning alone, hands in his pockets, looking at the horizon, looking for something worthy of what he carried, finding the world quiet around him in the way it was always quiet, in the way it was always just another Tuesday. And moving forward anyway because forward was the only direction available, and because somewhere, in some world through some door the universe had not yet shown him, there was a fight that would finally mean something. And until that door appeared, the only thing to do was walk. And so he walked, and the ground held him, and the sky above him was ordinary, and behind him the world he had unmade was already beginning, slowly and without his help, to figure out what it wanted to become.